You won't believe who went to prison for a brutal murder and who actually did it. This case had everything: a horrifying crime, a confession no one questioned, and a twist so unbelievable it shattered public trust in the justice system. This is the shocking story of Angie Dodge and how truth stayed buried for nearly 2 decades. It was an ordinary summer morning in Idaho Falls, the kind where birds chirped early and the town moved at its usual quiet pace. Idaho Falls, nestled in eastern Idaho, had long been considered one of the safest places to live. Crimes were rare. Murders? Almost unheard of. But on June 13, 1996, everything changed. 18-year-old Angie Dodge, full of life and potential, was found brutally murdered in her small apartment on I Street. It was a discovery that sent waves of fear and disbelief across the tight-knit community. Friends, family, and even strangers were left in shock. Angie wasn't just any young woman. She was smart, ambitious, and full of promise. She had just graduated from Idaho Falls High School and recently started her first job. She had moved into her own apartment just weeks earlier, excited about independence and adulthood. But in the early hours of that terrible morning, someone ended all of that. Angie didn't show up for work. That immediately alarmed her coworkers and friends. She was known to be responsible, always on time. Her absence was noticed. One of her friends, concerned, decided to stop by her apartment to check on her. What they found was horrifying. Inside the apartment, Angie's body was discovered. The scene was nothing short of gruesome. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed repeatedly. Blood covered parts of the room. It was clear that whoever had attacked her did so with both rage and precision. It wasn't just a murder, it was savagery. The sheer violence suggested the killer may have known Angie personally, or at least had some emotional intensity driving the attack. The police were called immediately. The crime scene was cordoned off and detectives began their work, but from the beginning, they were under enormous pressure. The media had picked up the story almost instantly, and residents were terrified. Idaho Falls hadn't seen anything like this in years, if ever. People started double-checking their locks. Women, especially young women living alone, began sleeping with lights on. Everyone wanted answers. And fast. Investigators collected evidence, including DNA from the crime scene. They interviewed neighbors, friends, co-workers. They built a timeline of Angie's last known movements. But within days, it became clear. There were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, and very little to go on. This put investigators in a tough spot. They had DNA, but in 1996, DNA technology was still developing. It wasn't as widely used, and the databases weren't as complete as they are today. So even though they had a profile, it wasn't matching anyone in their system. As time ticked on, the pressure to solve the case quickly mounted. The public wanted closure, the family wanted justice, the police wanted a suspect. And that's where the first major twist in this story begins. Detectives turned their attention to Christopher Tapp, a 20-year-old man who lived in Idaho Falls and was loosely connected to people in Angie's social circle. Tapp had no prior criminal history involving violence. He wasn't on police radar in any serious way. But he had hung around a group that included some people who were known to police for petty crimes, and that was enough. Christopher was brought in for questioning not as a suspect, but simply to provide information. However, what started as a basic interview soon spiraled into a relentless interrogation campaign. And in the background of all of this, one chilling fact remained. The real killer was still out there. Meanwhile, Angie Dodge's murder continued to haunt the community. News outlets ran stories about her life, how she loved reading and writing, how she was known for her big smile and kind heart. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She wasn't in trouble. She was just a young woman beginning life on her own. But behind those headlines was a mother, Carol Dodge, who had just lost her only daughter. For Carol, this wasn't just a news story, this was personal. She buried her daughter far too young and didn't yet realize she'd be spending the next 2 decades fighting for the truth. In many ways, what happened in Angie's apartment that night was only the first crime. What followed the investigation, the confession, the trial would become part of a story that was even more complicated and just as heartbreaking. And it all started in a quiet town where no one thought something like this could ever happen. When the investigation into Angie Dodge's murder stalled, detectives began looking for leads anywhere they could. With the community on edge and media pressure mounting, they needed to show progress. That's when their attention turned to a young man named Christopher Tapp. At the time, Christopher was just 20 years old. He had no violent criminal record, no known connection to Angie, and no obvious motive. But he was loosely connected to a small group of local young men who had minor run-ins with the law. He wasn't a suspect, but the police believed he might know something useful, so they brought him in for questioning, and that decision would have life-altering consequences. What started as a casual conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown interrogation. Over the course of 3 weeks, Tapp was questioned multiple times, often for hours at a stretch. He didn't have a lawyer present. He wasn't even fully aware of his rights. He was a scared, inexperienced young man, completely unprepared for what the system was about to put him through. At first, Christopher denied any involvement. He consistently stated he had nothing to do with Angie Dodge's murder, and he was telling the truth. There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. His DNA did not match the sample collected from the scene. He didn't know specific details about the crime that only the killer would have known. But the interrogations continued. Detectives used classic psychological pressure tactics, isolating him, presenting false evidence, feeding him details, and, most notably, suggesting that if he told them what they wanted to hear, he might avoid the death penalty. Over time, Tapp began to doubt himself. The officers convinced him that he may have repressed memories, or that perhaps he was present, but just didn't remember. Eventually, after endless pressure, he broke down. Christopher Tapp confessed to being present during Angie's murder and implicated another friend as the primary attacker. He didn't name Brian Dripps the actual killer because he didn't know him. His confession was based on suggestions from the interrogators. It was a story molded by the investigators, not reality. But here's the chilling part. Despite the glaring inconsistencies, the DNA still didn't match Christopher Tapp or anyone he mentioned. The confession had major holes. Tapp claimed to have held Angie down while someone else attacked her, yet there was no physical evidence placing him at the scene. His timeline didn't add up. His story changed multiple times. Still, the police and prosecutors pushed forward. They had a taped confession. That was enough for them. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of rape and murder. The jury heard his confession and believed it. They saw the police as trustworthy, and Tapp's story, though shaky as enough to prove his involvement. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. In the eyes of the public, justice had been served. A dangerous man was behind bars. The town could breathe again. But underneath the surface, something was terribly wrong. Even at trial, doubts remained. Legal experts later reviewed the tapes and pointed out how investigators had coached Christopher through key details. His memories were clearly being shaped in real time. When he got something wrong, detectives corrected him. When he hesitated, they guided him. It wasn't a confession, it was compliance. Worse, the physical evidence completely contradicted the confession. How could a man be guilty of rape and murder when his DNA wasn't at the scene? Prosecutors argued he had an accomplice, that his role was limited, but still criminal. They leaned heavily on the confession and not the science. Over the years, legal experts, journalists, and advocacy groups began to raise questions. Organizations like the Innocence Project started to look deeper into the case. They believed Tapp had been coerced. They believed the system had failed. But Christopher Tapp sat in prison for more than 20 years, watching time slip away. He lost his youth, his family ties, and his reputation, all for a crime he did not commit. Meanwhile, the real killer remained free, living a normal life not far from the scene of the crime. This chapter in the Angie Dodge case is a haunting reminder of how powerful a confession can be even when it's false. And how, under pressure, people can be led to say things that destroy their lives just to make the nightmare stop. What happened to Christopher Tapp wasn't just a mistake, it was a catastrophic failure of justice, and it would take years to finally make it right. While the world moved on, one person refused to accept the official story: Carol Dodge, Angie's mother. She had lost her only daughter in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. But Carol wasn't just mourning, she was also questioning everything about how the case had been handled. And the more she dug into it, the more things didn't add up. Carol had sat through every minute of Christopher Tapp's trial. She had listened closely to the confession, studied the timeline, and watched the evidence being presented. At first, like many in the courtroom, she wanted to believe that the right man had been caught, but one detail kept gnawing at her. Christopher's DNA wasn't found at the crime scene. That didn't sit right with Carol. Her daughter had been sexually assaulted, and the DNA profile recovered was clear and uncontaminated. If Christopher had been involved in the attack, shouldn't his DNA have been there? Prosecutors argued that he helped hold Angie down, but even that scenario should have left some trace, yet nothing connected him physically to the murder. Carol began asking questions not just to herself, but to lawyers, investigators, and even DNA experts. She wasn't a scientist or a private detective, she was a grieving mother. But her instincts were sharp, and her determination was unlike anything law enforcement had prepared for. Instead of fading into the background like most families do after a conviction, Carol became obsessed with learning everything about the case, especially DNA. She read everything she could get her hands on, attended forensic conferences, and even wrote letters to experts in the field. Her house turned into a research station. Her dining table was covered in files, newspaper clippings, police reports, and court transcripts. Carol believed two things with absolute certainty: her daughter deserved real justice, and Christopher Tapp was not the whole story if he was even part of it at all. Years passed, but Carol didn't stop. In fact, she started working with people who believed in Tapp's innocence. She reached out to attorneys, journalists, and advocacy groups. That's when she connected with the Innocence Project, a nonprofit legal organization that specializes in exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals through DNA testing. At first, some people questioned her motives. Why would a murder victim's mother try to free the man convicted of killing her daughter? Carol had one answer: because I want the truth, and I don't believe the truth was told in that courtroom. With her support, the Innocence Project dug deep into the case. They re-examined the taped confessions. It became painfully clear that Christopher had been coached and pressured into his statements. On the tapes, police could be heard feeding him information and correcting him when he got details wrong, a clear sign of a coerced confession. Even more alarming, there was zero physical evidence tying Christopher Tapp to the crime scene. It was all based on a confession one extracted after more than 25 hours of recorded interrogation over several days, without an attorney, without rest, and often with misleading suggestions. The Innocence Project, along with Carol, demanded new DNA testing using updated forensic techniques. And while they waited for those results, Carol took a bold step. She publicly stated that she believed the wrong man had been imprisoned for her daughter's murder. That moment shocked the community. It's not every day a mother sides with the man accused of killing her child. But Carol made it clear this wasn't about defending Christopher, it was about finding the real killer. And if Tapp wasn't the one, then someone else had gotten away with it for over 20 years. In 2017, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Christopher Tapp was released from prison. 2 years later, in 2019, he was formally exonerated. The courts admitted the confession had been false. The case had been built on flawed interrogation, not facts. Robert's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. Kennedy continued. In Wickard versus Filburn, the court stretched the Commerce Clause to include a farmer growing wheat for personal use, a mistake in my opinion. But even then, the court acknowledged limits. Today, I fear those limits are being forgotten, perhaps ignored. He flipped to the next page. Let me be clear, I'm not here to grandstand. I'm here because people back home in Louisiana and across the country feel that the institutions they're supposed to trust are slipping into arrogance. We have judges who act like lawmakers and lawmakers who forget who they work for. The room had gone silent again. Not a single camera moved, not a whisper from the press box. Everyone was tuned in because this wasn't just legal theory. It was a lesson in humility, in accountability, in constitutional balance. And Kennedy delivered it not with anger, but with precision. He moved on to United States versus Lopez, the 1995 decision that reined in federal power under the Commerce Clause. Now that case, Kennedy said, tapping the paper in front of him, was a reminder that not everything falls under the umbrella of federal oversight. And yet today, we see rulings that are once again expanding the federal scope in ways that I believe are not only overreach, but dangerous. Roberts shifted in his seat and for the first time looked visibly unsure. He reached for a pen, not to interrupt, but to take notes. Kennedy pressed on, not in a harsh or aggressive way, but like a professor calmly correcting a student who had overstepped. The Constitution is not a buffet, Kennedy said. You don't get to pick the parts that suit you and skip the rest. When the court begins to behave more like a legislative body than an interpreter of law, that's when we have a problem. He paused, not for effect, but to let the weight of the statement settle. He glanced again at Roberts. With all due respect, Chief Justice, I let you speak uninterrupted. I'd appreciate the same courtesy. The line landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. It was respectful, but firm. And it was clear, Kennedy wasn't just demanding attention, he was commanding it. In that moment, Kennedy reminded the nation why he can never be written off as just another folksy Southern politician. Beneath the charm was a formidable legal intellect, someone who understood the Constitution, not just as a document, but as a living promise. And he was here to make sure it wasn't forgotten. As the hearing wore on, the atmosphere remained electrified. Not because of anger or chaos, but because of clarity. Kennedy had cut through the noise and gotten to the core of what people feared, that power in robes is still power, and power must always answer to the Constitution. And today, that message had been delivered calmly, sharply, brilliantly. As Senator Kennedy continued to speak, a strange thing began to happen, something subtle but unmistakable. The energy in the hearing room began to shift. Moments earlier, the mood had been firmly in Chief Justice Roberts' favor. He was the authority figure. The man in the black robe. The one whose presence alone usually silenced opposition. But now, his control over the room was slipping, not because of volume or confrontation, but because of the simple, undeniable weight of Kennedy's argument. Kennedy had that rare ability to hold a room not with theatrics, but with thought. And the longer he spoke, the quieter the room became. Reporters who had been glancing at their phones now looked up, wide-eyed. Legal aides from both parties leaned in. The click-clack of keyboards slowed to near silence. All eyes were on Kennedy, who, page by page, was taking the Chief Justice and everyone watching through a constitutional deep dive. And he wasn't doing it with a law professor's detachment. He was doing it with the passion of someone who believed the law belonged to the Pioplannat, to elites, not to courtrooms, but to the American citizen. The Founding Fathers, Kennedy continued, didn't create a judiciary to rule the people. They created a judiciary to protect the people from power, from overreach, from arrogance. The Constitution is not a shield for government. It's a shield for citizens. That line sent chills through the room. One could feel the shift not just in tone, but in respect. This wasn't a senator bluffing through a confrontation. This was a man who had done the reading, who had lived the law, who had studied its roots and remembered its purpose. And now, in the heart of the Capitol, he was reminding the highest judge in the land of exactly that. Roberts, to his credit, remained composed. But even he couldn't hide the subtle signs of discomfort. The slight furrow of his brow, the way he gripped his pen a little tighter, the occasional nod not condescending, but careful, cautious, almost respectful, because Roberts, for all his brilliance, knew what he was witnessing. Kennedy wasn't just arguing, he was winning. And it wasn't just the words Kennedy was saying, it was how he said them. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, no political cheap shots, just clear, firm, evidence-based reasoning. He moved between centuries-old rulings and modern misapplications with ease. He quoted Madison and Hamilton like he'd spoken to them personally. He spoke of states' rights not as a slogan, but as a balance mechanism designed to protect the people from centralized dominance. "This isn't about left or right," Kennedy said firmly. "This is about whether we still remember that power in this country flows upward from the people to the government, not the other way around." That statement landed like a thunderclap. Across the internet, clips of Kennedy's testimony were already spreading like wildfire. Legal analysts were jumping into live streams to explain what just happened. Some said it was the most articulate rebuke of judicial overreach they'd seen in decades. Others were simply stunned that a moment meant to embarrass Kennedy had turned into a full-blown masterclass on constitutional limits. And still, Kennedy pressed on. He used analogies. He told a story of a farmer in his district who got fined for building a shed too close to a wetland classified by a federal agency that, ironically, was never elected by anyone. "And we call that democracy?" he asked, looking directly at the Chief Justice. "We call that justice?" By now, even senators from the opposing party were nodding along, not necessarily in agreement with every point, but in recognition of the argument's quality. It wasn't partisan, it was principled. Even those who didn't like Kennedy's politics couldn't deny his command of the room. For a brief moment, the hearing wasn't about sides. It was about something deeper, something more rare in Washington: honesty and clarity. As Kennedy reached the final page of his notes, he closed the folder, looked directly at Chief Justice Roberts, and simply said, "We're all accountable to the same document, Judge. No robe, no title, no bench puts anyone above the Constitution." "I trust you agree with that." Roberts looked up. No smile, no smirk, just a slow, almost reluctant nod. It wasn't a concession, but it was a moment of mutual recognition. Kennedy had stood his ground, and more than Thade had earned something far rarer than applause in Washington. He had earned respect. The air in the room had changed. Gone was the smug assurance that Chief Justice John Roberts carried at the beginning of the hearing. Gone was the subtle condescension, the assumption that a man like Senator John Kennedy wouldn't pose much of a challenge. In its place was a more thoughtful, cautious demeanor. Roberts was now keenly aware that he had underestimated his opponent. He hadn't expected Kennedy to come armed not just with pointed questions, but with layered legal arguments, historical insight, and a deep, unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. And now, with the room watching him in near silence, it was Roberts' turn to respond. He cleared his throat softly. "Senator Kennedy," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "your remarks are thorough, and I don't say that lightly." There was no sarcasm in his tone. In fact, there was something rare in it: humility. He leaned slightly forward and continued. "You raise valid concerns about the trajectory of Commerce Clause jurisprudence. I may not agree with every conclusion, but I respect the depth of your constitutional reading." It was a respectful reply, but more than that, it was a retreat from the earlier posture. The shift wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a full surrender. But it was the kind of change that only occurs when someone powerful realizes they've been outmatched intellectually in front of the entire country. Roberts, known for his polished rhetoric and command over court language, had walked into the hearing ready to educate. Now, he was being careful not to be the one educated. "You referenced Wickard versus Filburn, and yes, that case has been criticized across ideological lines for its sweeping interpretation of federal power," Roberts continued. "And you are correct. United States versus Lopez was a moment where the court attempted to draw the line. These are difficult waters." Kennedy didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, arms crossed lightly, allowing Roberts the floor. It was a subtle power move. The man who was previously defending himself now had the upper hand, and he didn't need to flex either, simply held it. Roberts continued, now choosing his words more carefully than ever. "The court must often strike a balance between interpreting law and preserving institutional integrity," he said. "But your concern that this balance is being lost is not without merit.